On the night of November 8th, 2010, 53-year-old Bic Pan and a few of her friends were learning how to line dance at a church in Toronto, Canada. Bic and her friends had been going to the dance class every week for a while, and Bic finally felt like she was getting the hang of it. Bic was average height with long black hair, and she wore workout clothes, glasses, and bright red lipstick. And while she danced, she felt her feet aching and sweat was running down her face, but she couldn't stop laughing because she was having so much fun. When the last song ended, she and her friends made their way out of the church into the parking lot. It was a mild November night for Toronto, with temperatures around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But after getting hot and sweaty while dancing, Bic felt a slight chill when she stepped outside. She and her friends laughed more as they talked about some of their least graceful moments on the dance floor. Then they all said goodnight, and they'd see each other at the church the following week for more line dancing. And Bic walked across the parking lot, got into her Lexus car, and drove off towards her house in the suburbs. And while she drove, she looked out the windshield at Toronto passing by, and she thought about what a fun night she had just had, and she felt happy and like she belonged here in Toronto. And that was a big deal for Bic, because it had taken her a long time to feel that way. Bic had come to Canada about 30 years earlier in the late 1970s when her family fled Vietnam as political refugees after the Vietnam War. She had grown up speaking Vietnamese and Cantonese, and so when she came to Canada in her 20s, learning English had been hard for her at first. And she had struggled to find work, and she didn't feel like she fit in anywhere she went. But then, Bic had reconnected with a man she had known briefly in Vietnam, Han Pan. Like Bic, Han had come to Canada from Vietnam with his family following the war, and Han had also grown up speaking Vietnamese and Cantonese. And so, when Bic and Han met in Canada, it was like they finally had someone who understood everything they had gone through, and they had quickly fallen in love and gotten married, and a few years into their marriage, they had started a family, having a daughter and then a son. And together, Bic and Han had worked hard to make money and put enough away to give their children more opportunities than they had when they were growing up. And while it had never been easy, Bic felt like she and Han had achieved that goal, because when the children were young, they had done really well in school and had participated in different extracurricular activities and had made great friends. And now that their kids were in their 20s, they were pursuing good, stable careers, and so Bic was finally giving herself a chance to relax a little and enjoy the place that had been her home for 30 years. At about 9:30 p.m., Bic pulled into her secluded neighborhood in Markham, a large suburb of Toronto, and she drove towards her house. Big two-story homes lined the streets, and the neighborhood was calm and quiet. Bic pulled into her driveway, and she noticed that most of the trees in her and her neighbors' yards had started to lose their leaves. She thought that was a shame because she loved the burst of color the changing leaves gave the neighborhood in early fall. Then, Bic opened the garage door and parked her Lexus in the garage next to her husband Han's Mercedes-Benz. Bic closed the garage door, stepped out of her car, and winced a little because her feet had gotten even more sore from her night of line dancing. Then she went inside the house and walked down a long hall into the living room. Bic's house was big, with high ceilings, hardwood floors, a basement that had been converted into a family room, and a staircase that led to 4 bedrooms on the second floor. But the prized possession in the house, at least as far as Bic was concerned, was the piano in the living room downstairs. When Bic and Han were younger, they had worked and saved to buy that piano for their daughter, Jennifer. And as Jennifer grew up, Bic and Han knew they had spent their money wisely, because Jennifer had been a gifted piano player from the time she was a little girl. And even now, at 24 years old, Jennifer still played the piano regularly and made extra money working as a piano teacher. And listening to her daughter play that piano in the living room was still one of Bic's favorite things in the world. Bic walked through the living room past the piano and slowly made her way upstairs. Her feet felt like they were pounding, so she held onto the banister to make her climb a little easier. And when she got to the second floor hallway, her daughter, Jennifer, popped out of her bedroom, smiled, and said hello. Jennifer was 5 foot 7 inches tall, with black hair tied into a long ponytail, and she wore a white sweatshirt, black yoga pants, and a pair of glasses with black frames. Jennifer was about to go back to school and start classes at a nearby college to become a pharmacist, and she had lived with a friend closer to Toronto for a while, but now she'd moved back home with her parents, and she'd managed to save up a good amount of money for school from teaching her piano lessons. Bic knew Jennifer was very much a young Canadian woman who saw her Vietnamese parents as somewhat old-fashioned, But Bick hoped that she and Han had at least passed on their beliefs about working hard and saving money to their daughter. Bick and Jennifer talked to each other in Vietnamese, and Jennifer laughed while Bick recounted stories from that night's dance class, and Jennifer's laugh was infectious, so before long, Bick started laughing too. Then Bick said she wanted to get changed, so Jennifer went back into her bedroom, and Bick headed down the hall to her and Han's bedroom. When Bick walked in, Han was already drifting off to sleep in bed, but he woke up enough to say hello to his wife and ask how her dance class went. Bick said she'd had a great time and couldn't wait to go again next week, and then she changed into her pajamas, which had pictures of Winnie the Pooh on them. Then Bick told Han goodnight and walked back downstairs. She went into the kitchen, grabbed a large bowl out of a cabinet, went over to the sink, and filled the bowl with ice-cold water. Then she walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. She put the bowl down in front of her on the floor, and then put her feet inside the bowl. Bick smiled and leaned back on the couch. The ache in her feet was finally starting to go away. Bick grabbed the remote off an end table, turned on the TV, and found the channel that showed Chinese news programs in Cantonese. Because as much as Bick might have finally felt at home in Canada after living there all those years, she still enjoyed ending her nights by watching the news in one of her first languages. Then Bick heard footsteps coming down the stairs. She turned and saw her daughter, Jennifer, walking into the living room. Jennifer headed towards her mother on the couch, but then suddenly stopped cold. Jennifer turned and looked out one of the living room windows to the street in front of the house, like she saw something that she couldn't quite make out. Then she walked to the front door and looked out the small window on it, and she leaned in close to try to get a better look. Bick turned away from the TV and asked her daughter if everything was okay, and Jennifer, who now had a chance to see what was out there, realized that what she had seen outside was just a car parked across the street. So she stepped back from the door and told her mom that, you know what, everything's fine, it's just a car. Then Jennifer said goodnight to her mom and headed upstairs. Bick turned back to the TV, and as she watched the news, she stretched out a little more on the couch, and she felt like this was the perfect end to her day. At almost 10:15 p.m., about 45 minutes after Bick had gotten home, she was still downstairs soaking her feet and watching the Chinese news. And Jennifer was lying in bed in her room upstairs. Her room was filled with Jennifer's college textbooks that she had marked up with notes over the years, and she knew when she went back to school soon to pursue her career as a pharmacist, she'd have to start hitting the books again. But she still had a couple of months before classes started, so she wasn't thinking too much about school yet. Instead, she had spent most of the night just texting with some friends and with her ex-boyfriend, Daniel Wong. Jennifer and Daniel had dated for years, going back to their time in high school together, and Jennifer had thought they were destined to get married someday. But then, over a year earlier, Daniel had broken up with Jennifer and he'd started seeing someone else. But even after they'd broken up, Jennifer and Daniel remained friends. They had a lot in common, they liked spending time together, and they were both willing to give advice when the other one needed it. And recently, their text messages and occasional phone calls had gotten a little flirtatious, and so Jennifer thought there might be a chance that she and Daniel could get back together. So she laid in bed with her phone in her hand, looking at the last text she'd sent to Daniel, and wondering if she should send another one. But then, Jennifer heard the sound of the front door downstairs open and slam shut, and then Jennifer heard the sound of someone walking through the house. So, confused, Jennifer stood up, slipped her phone into the waistband of her yoga pants, and she walked over to her door, she opened it up, and she called downstairs to her mom to see what was going on. And then, Jennifer heard the sound of her mother screaming. So Jennifer rushed out into the hallway, but before Jennifer could do anything, she heard loud footsteps at the bottom of the stairs, and then suddenly she saw this huge man dressed in black running up the stairs towards her. Then Jennifer heard Bick shout something in Vietnamese, and she heard men yelling at her mother downstairs in English. Jennifer shouted to her mother again, but the man dressed in black was still coming up the stairs towards Jennifer, and when he made it all the way up the stairs, he grabbed Jennifer, raised a pistol to her face, and yelled, "Where's the money?" And then he pushed Jennifer back into her bedroom. When they were in the bedroom, the huge man in black shouted again at Jennifer, "Where's the money?" So Jennifer ran to her bedside table, she opened a drawer, grabbed an envelope, and took out $2,500 in cash, some of the money she had been saving from teaching her piano lessons. The man grabbed the cash from Jennifer and put it in his pocket. Then he took Jennifer roughly by the arm and led her back into the hallway. He brought her down the stairs and put her in the living room. Jennifer looked around, but she didn't see her mom or her dad anywhere. And then the man in black grabbed Jennifer and led her to the basement door. And when the door was opened up, Jennifer's heart started pounding because she could hear in the basement her mother and father yelling in a mix of Vietnamese and Cantonese, and Jennifer could tell they were scared and confused. The man with Jennifer told her to walk down into the basement, and with each step she took, the yelling from her parents got louder and louder. Jennifer finally reached the bottom of the stairs, and she saw her mom and dad on the basement couch, and she saw 2 more men dressed in black pointing guns at them. And the men kept screaming at Bick and Han, demanding to know where they kept all of their money. But Bick and Han were so scared, and they struggled to reply in English. And when they spoke, the men with guns didn't really understand them, and so they got angrier and angrier and just began yelling louder and louder at the parents. And so Jennifer, not knowing what else to do, just yelled in Vietnamese for her parents to please try to stay calm. And Han, when he heard this, he looked up from the couch and he saw his daughter at the bottom of the stairs. And at that point, he took a breath and he looked right at one of the gunmen. And in English, Han said, "Please don't hurt our daughter." And then that gunman who Han was speaking to turned to the man in black who had been leading Jennifer around and told him to take Jennifer back upstairs and keep looking for the money. So the big man in black led Jennifer back up the basement steps, and as Jennifer walked up to the first floor, she could hear her parents screaming again and the gunman just screaming right back at them. Once Jennifer and her captor were out of the basement, he led her from room to room on the first and second floors, and he had her pull drawers out of cabinets, throw mattresses off the beds, and basically tear the house apart looking for more money. But all Jennifer could find was about $1,000 in cash tucked away in Bick's bedside table, and she said she didn't know about any other money in the house. So, almost 20 minutes after the 3 intruders had first entered the house, Jennifer's captor walked her across the upstairs hallway, and when they reached the top of the stairs, he told her to get on the floor. Then he pulled 2 long black shoelaces out of his pocket, he crouched down, and he grabbed one of Jennifer's arms, and he tied it to a metal bar that supported the banister on the stairs. Then he took the other shoelace and tied her hands behind her back. Once the man was sure Jennifer was restrained, he left her there, and he headed downstairs, and Jennifer heard the sound of the basement door open and slam shut again. Jennifer tried to stay as calm as she could, but she was borderline panicking. However, as she laid there, she felt that she could actually move her hands a little bit behind her back. So she took a deep breath and stretched her fingers out to feel her phone tucked into the waistband of her yoga pants. And she slowly pulled the phone out and held it in both of her bound hands, and she was able to crane her neck around just enough to see the keypad. But then the basement door flew open, and Jennifer heard the sound of footsteps running across the floor downstairs. And then she heard the front door open and close, and she thought she heard one of her parents screaming, and then the front door opening again. So Jennifer took another deep breath, she looked down at her phone, and she managed to punch in 911. And when the emergency operator picked up, Jennifer started yelling that people had broken into her house and she didn't know if her parents were okay and they needed to send help immediately. Minutes after this 911 call, Constable Mike Stesko of the Markham Police sped through the streets of the Pan family's quiet neighborhood with his sirens blaring. Stesko's rookie partner, Brian Derrick, was in the passenger seat, and the young man couldn't believe what was happening. He was shocked when they got the call that there had been a break-in nearby because breaking and entering, and most major crimes, were rare in this part of town. But over the years, the older cop, Stesko, had learned that dangerous people can be anywhere, even in nice neighborhoods with big houses and luxury cars parked in the garage. Stesko eased off the gas when he saw flashing lights from police cruisers and ambulances right outside of the Pan's house. He parked the car, and he and his rookie partner, Derek, stepped outside. And immediately, Stesko worried that they were dealing with something far worse than just a robbery, because Jennifer's father, Han, was lying on his driveway and blood was pouring down his face. Paramedics were already hovering over Han, so Stesko, Derek, and several other officers walked towards the front door. They had no idea if the robbers were still inside, so they all drew their weapons and quickly talked about doing a sweep of the house to look for the intruders. And then one of the officers opened the front door and they all rushed inside. And right away they heard the sound of a young woman screaming upstairs. Derek and a few other officers rushed upstairs past Jennifer. They searched all of the rooms to make sure no intruders were up there, and then when it was all clear, they came back to Jennifer. Derek cut Jennifer's hands loose, he helped her up, and then started walking her downstairs. And as they walked, all Jennifer kept asking was whether or not her parents were okay, but Derek didn't have an answer. Then Derek led Jennifer outside towards the paramedics, and at that point, Jennifer saw her father, Han, on a gurney being loaded into the back of an ambulance. And she yelled out, "Daddy, are you okay?" But Han didn't answer back. And the ambulance door shut, its sirens rang out, and Han was raced off to the nearest hospital. At this point, paramedics rushed over and surrounded Jennifer to see if she was injured, and they wanted to know if any of the intruders had assaulted her. And while Derek stayed with Jennifer outside as she talked to the paramedics, his partner, Constable Stesko, was inside the house still, following a trail of blood across the hardwood floors that led from the living room on the first floor to the basement door. The basement had not been cleared yet, so Stesko still had his weapon drawn. He opened the basement door and slowly descended the stairs, and he could hear each step creak under his feet as he moved deeper into the basement. And when Stesko got about halfway down the stairs, he could finally see into the small family room the Pans had set up in the basement, and his eyes went wide. He stopped, turned back to the open door, and yelled for paramedics. Then Stesko rushed down the rest of the steps into the center of that room, and he saw someone lying face down on the floor with a blood-soaked blanket covering their face and part of their back. Stesko yelled to this person to see if they might respond, but he knew it was no use. And seconds later, paramedics rushed in and they tried to revive the victim on the ground, but it was too late. Jennifer's mother, Bick, was dead on the basement floor. At 1:30 a.m. on the morning of November 9th, so over 3 hours after the home invasion had begun, Jennifer was sitting on a bed in a hospital room in Markham. Doctors had examined her and found that she was physically okay, but they had given her anxiety medication to help calm her down. The door to the room opened, and Jennifer looked up and saw Constable Derek, the rookie cop. He was young and handsome, and he had a nice smile, and he was Scottish and still spoke with a soft Scottish accent. Derek walked over to Jennifer and asked her if she was okay, and she said she was, but really all she wanted to talk about was her parents. Where were they? When could she see them? And Derek, as gently as he could, told her that her father had been airlifted to a trauma center in Toronto and that he was in a medically induced coma. An induced coma is used by doctors in some instances to help protect an injured person from suffering brain damage. Jennifer asked if her dad was going to be okay, but Derek said it was just too early to tell. Then she asked what happened to her mother, and Derek glanced at the floor for a second, and then he looked up at Jennifer, and he said he was so sorry, but her mother had been killed. Jennifer just stared at Derek for a long time, unable to speak. It was like she was so shocked by what she heard that she just froze. Then Derek broke the silence by telling her again how sorry he was, and he said he hated to put her through anything else, but he needed her to come to the police station right now to help police figure out what happened. And Jennifer, who clearly was in shock, just nodded her head and said she'd help any way she could. And so Derek helped Jennifer gather up her things, and he led her out of the hospital to a squad car, and as they drove through the dark, empty streets in the early hours of the morning, Jennifer just stared out the window. Suddenly, the town she had grown up in looked different, and she knew her life would now never be the same. At 2:45 a.m., so about an hour after Jennifer had left the hospital, Derek led her into a small interrogation room at the Markham police station and helped her into a chair at a wooden table that was pressed up against the wall. Derek walked across the room and took a seat. He was there just to observe, while a member of the York Regional Police conducted the actual interview. And the regional police officer knew how shaken Jennifer was, and so he reassured her that they were all just there to try to get as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. Jennifer said she understood, and then she did her best to walk the officer through what she had seen in her house the previous night. She told him about the big man dressed in black, grabbing her, pulling her out of her room, dragging her down into the basement where her parents were, and then taking her back upstairs to look for money. Then she said the man had tied her to the banister, tied her wrists, but she still could move enough to get her phone and call 911. And she said when she was making that call, she heard what sounded like one of the intruders running across the first floor and running outside. And then right after that, she had heard the sound of someone screaming and also going out the front door. And she didn't realize it at the time, but now she thought that that second person, the screaming, must have been coming from her father, and he must have been trying to get out of the house, because she knew police had found him in the driveway outside when they had arrived. The officer asked Jennifer if she could identify any of the men who had come into the house, but she said they were all dressed in black and their faces were covered, and they were all much bigger than she was. Then the officer leaned in a little closer to her and asked Jennifer what was her relationship like with Daniel Wong. And immediately, a confused look came across Jennifer's face, and she said she and Daniel had dated for years, but now they were just friends. The officer nodded and then asked her if she knew that Daniel was a drug dealer. And for a second, Jennifer just stared at him, and then she said, well, Daniel did sell a little marijuana when he was in college, but that's it. And sensing the direction that the police were taking this, Jennifer said again that, Daniel was just her friend and that there was no way he could have anything to do with anything like this. The officer scribbled some notes down in a small notepad and then quickly moved on to another line of questioning. And for the next 2 hours, he and Jennifer would talk through the night several times over, and by the end of the interview, all the police really knew was that they were looking for 3 tall young men. And despite what Jennifer might think about this, the police believed that her ex-boyfriend, Daniel Wong, could absolutely be one of those 3 men. At 10 a.m., about 5 hours after Jennifer left the police station, she was pacing back and forth in a waiting room at a Toronto hospital. Jennifer's younger brother, who was a college student, had come back into town early that morning when he got the news about the attack on his family. And now he was sitting in a chair watching his sister walk back and forth while they both waited anxiously for any news about their dad. Jennifer had maybe dozed off for a few minutes earlier that morning, but she really hadn't slept in well over 24 hours. And so she felt jittery and she couldn't stop moving her hands and her mind felt foggy, but she told herself to stay awake and stay calm and just wait to hear any news about their dad. And then finally, a doctor walked into the room and Jennifer stopped pacing. The doctor had a very serious look on his face, and Jennifer and her brother kind of held their breath. But the doctor said things were looking good, and he believed their father, Han, would recover from his injuries. And after hearing that, Jennifer's brother got out of his chair, and he and his sister hugged. The doctor told them that they would need to be patient though, because Han was still in the induced coma, and it could be days before he came out of it. Jennifer and her brother said they totally understood, and they thanked the doctor for giving them the good news, and that they would wait to hear more. When the doctor walked out of the room, Jennifer and her brother just stood there in silence for about a minute. The news about their dad was very positive, but they both realized that focusing on their dad had given them an excuse not to think about what had happened to their mother. And now it was like suddenly it had hit them that Bic, their mother, was gone. And so after this long pause in total silence, Jennifer just looked over at her brother and said she was going to start making some calls to try to start arranging their mother's funeral. At 4 p.m. on November 10th, so 2 days after the fatal home invasion, Jennifer's ex-boyfriend, Daniel Wong, sat in a police interrogation room at the Markham police station. Daniel had black, spiky hair, and he wore glasses, jeans, and a black t-shirt. He sat across the table from a veteran Markham police detective, but Daniel didn't seem nervous or intimidated in any way. The veteran detective did not waste any time with small talk. Instead, he leaned in across the table and asked Daniel point blank about his history as a drug dealer. But Daniel didn't flinch. He admitted that he'd sold marijuana for years in college and that he had gotten busted on drug charges when he was younger. But now, he said, he had a good full-time job managing a pizza parlor and that he didn't deal any drugs anymore. Then the detective asked Daniel what his relationship was with Jennifer's parents, Bic and Han. Daniel, very calmly, told the detective that he always thought Jennifer's parents were strict when it came to Jennifer dating, that when she was younger, they really focused on her getting good grades and excelling in school. But then Daniel quickly added that in his own experience, and in the experience of a lot of his friends, Jennifer's parents weren't much different than most Asian immigrant parents. The veteran detective sat back in his chair and just stared at Daniel for a minute. He was a little taken aback by how calm and straightforward this young guy was being. So the detective finally asked if Daniel had any thoughts on who might have wanted to hurt Jennifer and her parents. And for the first time in the interview, Daniel hesitated. He looked down at the floor and shifted in his chair, so the detective leaned across the table again and asked what Daniel was keeping from him. And at this point, Daniel looked up and he said he might know something, but he had promised he would never talk about it. And the detective said he understood that, but he needed to know if Daniel had information that could lead police to the men who had broken into Jennifer's house. Daniel nodded, and in a quiet voice, he told the detective that months earlier, Jennifer had called him crying, and when he had asked her what was wrong, she said that a group of men had attacked her near her house, and they had raped her. The room went completely silent, and the detective just stared at Daniel. Then the detective said that Jennifer had not told police anything like that. But Daniel said he wasn't surprised, because Jennifer had never told anyone about it other than him, and she had sworn him to secrecy because she felt sort of ashamed about it. Following this interview with Daniel, the investigative team still looked at Daniel as a potential suspect, but they wanted to act fast on this possible new lead about this group of men previously attacking Jennifer and raping her. And they wanted to interview Jennifer again to see if she would corroborate what Daniel had just told them about this attack on her. So, on November 11th, 3 days after the home invasion, Jennifer returned to the police station. And while detectives followed up with her, other members of the investigative team returned to the scene of the crime. And as they walked through the Pan's house, they found a key piece of evidence that they had overlooked on the night of the actual attack. And that piece of evidence and information from Jennifer's second interview would put police on the trail of a new suspect. And then on November 12th, 4 days after the fatal home invasion, Jennifer's father, Han, came out of his medically induced coma. And when Han spoke to the police, he gave them information that proved they were already on the right track. And so eventually, Han's information would lead police to discover exactly what had happened on the night Bick was killed. Based on Han's information, evidence found at the scene of the crime, interviews, and cell phone data collected throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night of the fatal home invasion, November 8th, 2010. At 10:15 p.m., 3 gunmen dressed in all black sat in a car parked in the shadows across the street from the Pan's house. Each of them held a pistol in their hand. One of the gunmen stared out the passenger side window at the Pan's house. He saw the TV was flickering in the living room window, and he saw one of the upstairs bedroom lights was on. The man took a deep breath and then looked at the other 2 men and told them it was time to move. Then all 3 gunmen got out of the car, they crouched down low and ran across the street, and one of them opened the Pan's front door, and all 3 rushed inside to the living room. Bick looked up from the TV, and the gunmen started yelling at her. Then one of them rushed her and grabbed her off the couch. The bowl she had been soaking her feet in fell over, and water spilled across the hardwood floor. Then one of the gunmen dragged Bick through the room and down into the basement. The other 2 gunmen ran upstairs and split up when they reached the second floor. One of the gunmen ran down the hall and threw open the door of the main bedroom where Han was sleeping, and the gunman screamed at him, "Where's the money?" And Han jolted upright in bed. But before he could figure out what was happening, the gunman had shoved a pistol into his face. Then the gunman grabbed Han by the arm, dragged him out of bed, and forced him downstairs into the basement with his wife. Once in the basement, the gunman threw Han onto the couch where Bick was already sitting and screaming. And the 2 gunmen who were in the basement with them yelled at Bick and Han more and more about wanting to know where their money was. Soon after that, the 3rd gunman came into the basement leading Jennifer, and Jennifer immediately yelled out to her parents to please try to calm down. And when her father, Han, saw his daughter, he began shouting at the gunman not to hurt her. Then the 3rd gunman took Jennifer out of the basement, while the other 2 gunmen stayed behind with Bick and Han. But Bick and Han continued to shout louder and louder at these 2 gunmen, pleading with them to spare them and to spare their daughter. And the 2 gunmen who were down there started to lose their confidence, like it would be really hard to shoot these 2 people who were begging for their lives right in front of them. So one of the gunmen walked across the room, grabbed a blanket off the arm of the couch, and threw it over Bick and Han's heads to kind of hide them from view, to make it easier to be really aggressive and violent with them. And then that gunman stepped back across the room and joined his partner, aiming their guns at Bick and Han. But Bick and Han continued to scream out from under the blankets, asking them to please spare us, spare our daughter. And finally, the two gunmen just looked at each other, and then they both aimed their weapons, one at Bick and the other at Han, and they both fired. The first bullet ripped through the blanket and struck Han near the corner of his right eye. Under the blanket, Han felt blood streaming down his face, and his head slumped over. A bullet from the other gun hit Bick in the neck, and blood spatter stained the inside of the blanket. Both gunmen fired again, and they both hit their victims in the shoulder, and under the blanket, Han and Bick stopped moving. But one of the gunmen walked back to the couch, raised his weapon to where Bick's head was under the blanket, and he fired one more time. This bullet struck Bick in the head and exited through the back of her skull, and she died on the basement couch right there. Upstairs on the second floor, the third gunman stood over Jennifer, who was tied to the banister. And when he heard those gunshots, he ran downstairs to the basement door, he opened it up, and began yelling for his partners to leave, and then he, the third gunman, who had been controlling Jennifer, ran outside. In the basement, the two gunmen looked at the bodies on the couch, and then they rushed up the basement steps. Neither of those two gunmen saw Han pull himself off the couch under the blanket and pull his wife's body out onto the floor with him. And they didn't hear Han as he got to his hands and knees and started making his way up the basement steps behind them. Because those two gunmen who had been in the basement were only focused on getting out of the house and back into their car. So they had bolted up the stairs of the basement into the living room, but they stopped when they heard shouting coming from behind them. And they turned around and saw Jennifer with her phone clutched in her bound hands at the top of the stairs. And then Jennifer said to them she would wait until she heard their car driving off before she called 911 to make sure they had a little extra time to get away. Jennifer Pan, the daughter who had once made Bick and Han so proud, had arranged for her parents to be murdered. Because it would turn out that Jennifer had been living a lie for almost 10 years and her parents had recently figured it out. Bick and Han had always believed Jennifer was a straight-A student who had gone on to excel in college. But the truth was, Jennifer had struggled with her grades and she never even graduated from high school. But when Jennifer had started to get bad grades in high school, she feared her perfectionist parents would ground her and keep her locked up in the house. And so she had started to forge her report cards to make it look like she was doing great in all of her classes. But as the lie went on, it had to get even bigger. So Jennifer had forged a high school diploma, and then she had forged an acceptance letter to a prestigious university and created a fake scholarship for herself that would mean her parents didn't have to pay for her college education. And so while her parents thought Jennifer was off at college being really successful, in reality she was just living with Daniel and making money teaching piano lessons. Because being a gifted piano player was maybe the only thing that Jennifer was not lying about. And Jennifer had used some of the money she had made teaching piano to buy college textbooks. And she marked the books up with fake notes and highlighted random passages so that when she was at her parents' house, she could show Bick and Han how hard she was working at school. Jennifer had gotten so good at lying that after another 4 years of living this totally fictitious life, she had convinced her parents that she graduated college with honors and with a degree that would allow her to become a pharmacist. And she even concocted an excuse as to why her parents couldn't come to her college graduation ceremony. But Jennifer's lie still had to keep going. So she had created fake ID badges and employment documents for a job that she didn't have. And she told her parents that she was moving in with a friend because her friend's apartment was right by where she worked. And so every day, Jennifer would hang out in cafes or spend time in the pizza parlor where Daniel worked, and then occasionally teach piano lessons to make some money, and then ultimately return back home to where she lived with Daniel. But all this lying finally came crashing down when Daniel had broken up with Jennifer, which meant she had to move out and back in with her parents. And as her father watched her leave for work every day, he started to get suspicious. Because Jennifer never seemed like she was in a rush to get out of the house, she never came home with work she had to get done, and she never wanted to meet for dinner or anything by where her job was located. And so one day, Han convinced Bick to follow Jennifer while he was at work, and Bick quickly discovered that Jennifer did not actually have a job. And soon after that, Bick and Han had confronted Jennifer, and Jennifer's years of lying started to unravel. And so, even though Jennifer was 24 years old, her parents told her that she was not allowed to leave the house without them, except to go teach piano. And they restricted her internet access, and they gave her an old flip phone that had limited text messaging capabilities, and Han checked that flip phone regularly to monitor who Jennifer was talking to. Han also made Jennifer take courses that would allow her to get her high school diploma, and then he made her enroll in a small local college program that would qualify her to become a pharmacist like she had pretended to be for years. And so, with all of these restrictions, Jennifer started to feel like she was a prisoner in the house she had grown up in, and she wanted out, and she wanted money. So she decided to kill her parents and get the large inheritance she knew would be coming from their deaths. Jennifer knew she didn't have the stomach to actually murder her parents herself, but she figured Daniel might know some people from his drug dealing days that might be willing to do it. But Daniel had broken up with Jennifer and kind of moved on, and so Jennifer needed to lure him back in. So one night she had called Daniel crying, and when he asked what was wrong, she lied again and told him that she had just been attacked and raped. And soon after that, Daniel and Jennifer started talking regularly again. And eventually, Jennifer offered Daniel money to find people to kill her parents. And so Daniel connected with an old drug buddy who said he'd do it, and that man brought in 2 more people to do the job with him. So Jennifer paid those 3 men to murder her parents, make it look like a robbery, and make it appear like Jennifer herself was a victim. She gave them a layout of the house, and she even unlocked the front door for them when she had gone downstairs into the living room to say goodnight to her mother, who was soaking her feet, on the night of the murder. And this bizarre, winding story started to become clear to the police when they went back to the scene of the crime. Because in Jennifer's room, they discovered that she had hidden a burner phone, which is a cheap prepaid phone people can use anonymously, that Daniel had bought for her. And on that burner phone, police found text messages between Jennifer, Daniel, and another man that sounded like they were planning a crime. And some of those text exchanges had taken place on the night of the murder. Then police discovered that Jennifer had called Daniel and the other man from the hospital where Han was to warn them that Han was going to recover. Finally, when Han came out of his medically induced coma, he told police what had happened in the basement. And he said when he cried out for the gunman not to hurt his daughter, he watched as his daughter leaned over and casually whispered something to the gunman who was supposedly her captor. And after that, Jennifer and this 3rd gunman just began laughing together, and then they casually walked together up the basement steps to the 1st floor. And in that moment, Han realized his daughter had arranged for he and his wife's execution. Jennifer Pan, Daniel Wong, and 2 of the 3 gunmen were found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted murder. They were sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole, which was the maximum sentence they could receive for the crime in Canada. The 3rd gunman was sentenced to 18 years in prison. And after Jennifer's trial, her father Han released a statement. He said he missed his wife terribly, and he hoped his daughter Jennifer would still become an honest person someday. On the afternoon of May 6, 2008, a 54-year-old man called Ricky Williams stood on the riverbank casting out his line into the waters of Dismal Creek in western Virginia. Ricky was hoping to get lucky and catch some trout, but he'd been out here fishing for 30 minutes so far, and there were no bites. Normally, Ricky wouldn't care because he loved just fishing for hours and hours at a time. But today, he and his dog, who was right with him, were really hungry because they'd been out in these woods camping for several weeks now, and their food supply was finally dwindling down to the end. And so if they didn't catch any fish today, they might not eat. Now, for context, where Ricky was fishing, Dismal Creek, despite its bleak name, it was actually a beautiful, secluded spot on top of a mountain that was on the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail is a very famous 2,200-mile-long trail that runs up and down the east coast of the United States. And why that is relevant is because there's this special code for people that hike on the Appalachian Trail. And the code, which all hikers know, is basically if you come across another hiker on the Appalachian Trail, it is your responsibility to help them if they need help. And it is their responsibility to help you if you need help. So it's this community of hikers that are always looking to help each other. And so Ricky was very aware of this code on the Appalachian Trail, and he was secretly hoping, as he cast his line over and over again and didn't get any bites, that a hiker or a group of hikers might come by this area, and maybe they would see him and come down and learn that he needed food, and they might just give him some of their food. But another half hour passed and no hikers came by, and still Ricky could not catch any fish. But then suddenly, Ricky's dog, who was right next to him, began to whine and kind of began shifting around like it was sensing a predator in the area or something. But as Ricky was trying to calm his dog down, he began to hear a voice in the woods right behind him. Somebody was moving towards him. And when Ricky heard this voice, on the one hand, he was pretty excited because maybe this is a hiker who can give him some food. But on the other hand, Ricky couldn't help but feel really uneasy. Now, you need to understand that Ricky was an older guy, he was kind of frail, and over the past few weeks that he'd been camping with his dog, as his food supply had run down, he had become skinnier and skinnier and skinnier, and so he really did not pose any sort of threat to anybody. He's like this weak older man. Now, generally speaking, the Appalachian Trail was a very safe place. But over the last few decades, there had actually been several murders that took place on the Appalachian Trail. And in fact, one of those killings took place less than 2 miles away from where Ricky was fishing with his dog. And in that double homicide, a very well-known killer named Randall Lee Smith had stabbed and shot to death 2 hikers. And so while Ricky was really looking for help from fellow hikers, at the same time, he couldn't help but feel somewhat apprehensive. Because again, Ricky was like this small, frail guy, and Ricky was well aware of these murders, and he was well aware of the fact that he was super close to one of the murder sites. And so Ricky was totally on edge as he's listening to this male voice get closer and closer, and then finally, this man in his early 30s steps out from the tree line, and he looks over and he sees Ricky, and for a second, the two men just kind of look at each other, but then this guy just grinned at Ricky and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And immediately Ricky felt relieved because he could tell just from looking at this guy that very likely he was not a threat. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston, and he told Ricky he was actually camping in the area with a friend of his, and they were out here fishing just like Ricky. And Ricky pretty much immediately said, "Oh, great, nice to meet you. Do you have any food for me?" And Scott was like, "Absolutely." And he dug into his bag that he had with him, and he pulled out a couple energy bars and a bag of chips, and he threw them over to Ricky. And he also gave some fresh bait to Ricky so he too could cast out again. And for the next couple of hours, Scott and Ricky just stood on the riverbank and fished together. And after a while, the trout did start biting and they did start catching fish, so the day kind of turned into a great outing for Ricky. And it got even better because as soon as the men were done fishing, Scott asked Ricky if he wanted to join him and his friend back up at the campsite for dinner. And remember, Ricky had no food, so this was an amazing invitation. And he said, "Yes, of course, I'd love to join you." So the two men packed up their stuff right as the sun was going down, and then they began walking back into the forest where Scott had emerged from. And as they were walking, Scott's fishing pole got tangled on a low-hanging branch, and he was really struggling to get it out of the tree. And so finally, he just told Ricky to, go on ahead. My campsite's right up there. It's a straight shot. Just go up the hill, and you'll see it. Ricky asked Scott if he was sure, and Scott said, "No, it's totally fine, go ahead." So Ricky said, "Okay," and he walked the rest of the way up the hill, and then when he walked out of the tree line into the clearing where Scott's campsite was, immediately what Ricky noticed was this enormous man who was like twice the size of Scott, and so 4 times the size of Ricky, kind of hunched over the campfire. And this huge man, who presumably was Scott's friend, he heard Ricky walk into the circle, and remember, it's nighttime and they're kind of in the middle of nowhere, and so this guy, he turns his head around and sees this strange man just standing there, and Scott's nowhere to be found, and so this guy, he grabs a club, like a piece of wood, and he looks at Ricky kind of menacingly, like, "What are you doing here?" And Ricky, who was so caught off guard by just how big this guy was, he put his hands up and he said, "I'm so sorry, Scott sent me up here. I don't know if this is the right site. I'm sorry." But just at that moment, Scott had finished untangling his fishing line, and he came out of the tree line and he patted Ricky on the back and he said, "Oh, you've already met my friend Sean." And as soon as he said that, Sean looked like he basically let his guard down. He put the wood down and he stopped glaring directly at Ricky. But Ricky felt like Sean was not happy that Ricky was in his campsite, even though clearly Scott is the reason that Ricky is in this campsite. And so Ricky just felt really uncomfortable. And at the same time, Scott is ushering Ricky closer to the campfire to take a seat next to Sean. Sean's a great cook. He'll cook up this fish for us. It's going to be great. Take a seat. Ricky felt kind of annoyed that Scott was really forcing him to stay, But Ricky didn't want to be rude and just kind of abruptly leave, so he did take a seat next to Sean, who definitely was not excited to be sitting next to Ricky, and Ricky just kind of sat there waiting to see what would happen next. And what happened next is Scott walked over to Sean and handed off all the fish that he and Ricky had caught so that Sean could begin to prepare them to cook them. And then as Ricky is still just sitting there right next to Sean, Scott walked away from the campfire up to his truck, which was parked right next to Sean's Jeep. And Scott turned on the radio and began blasting country music. And when Ricky heard this music, he kind of winced, because to him, part of the reason the outdoors, the Appalachian Trail, being out in nature, part of the reason it was so wonderful was for the peace and quiet. And so it felt kind of like borderline disrespectful to be out in the middle of this beautiful place, blaring country music. And so to Ricky, he just couldn't help but feel like there's something off about these two guys. They just seem really disrespectful and kind of pushy and maybe aggressive. And so Ricky is just not happy. But again, Ricky didn't say anything and didn't attempt to leave because, again, he's really hungry and so is his dog, and he needs to eat that fish. A moment later, Scott walked back from the truck and took a seat next to Sean, and then he, along with Sean, pulled out their knives and began deboning the fish. And as they were doing this, Ricky, again, is just kind of sitting there doing nothing, and so he kind of meagerly asked, hey, can you give me a knife and I'll clean a fish? But Sean and Scott kind of waved him off and said, don't worry, we got this. And so Ricky just continued to sit there nervously, as all he could watch was the flashing of the light bouncing off their blades. But eventually, Scott and Sean finished deboning all the fish, and they put their knives away, and at that point, they began cooking the fish over the open flame. And suddenly for Ricky, it felt like, the mood had shifted a little bit. At least now the two men were not fiddling around with weapons. It felt kind of safe again. And so Ricky began making some small talk in hopes that would kind of, settle his nerves. And so Ricky told the two men about how much he loved the Appalachian Trail and how he came out here all the time for weeks at a time with his dog. And Ricky would tell the men that, sometimes he felt more at home out in the wild than he did at home. It was almost like being out in nature was a religious experience for Ricky. And he would even tell Sean and Scott that sometimes when he was out in nature, he would meditate and pray and even do some chanting like part of a ritual. I mean, he was really trying to be in tune with Mother Nature. But as Ricky continued to tell Sean and Scott about his personal life, he noticed the two men were definitely paying attention and kind of nodding along at appropriate points in the story. But at the same time, Ricky felt like these two men were also kind of looking at him like Ricky was kind of weird, as if they were not prepared to come out and say it. But after hearing all these things about his life, it was like, what's going on with this guy? And so Ricky suddenly felt really embarrassed about being so open with these two guys who once again just seem like they don't quite like him or even really want him here. But luckily, right at that moment, the fish were done, and so the men just sat there in silence and wolfed down the food. By the time they finished, right about 8 p.m., it was very dark outside, and Ricky at this point is just ready to go. He just felt so uneasy here. And so after putting down his plate and his silverware and saying thank you to Sean and Scott for their hospitality, he quickly got up and grabbed his dog, and he began walking into the woods towards his campsite. But after Ricky and his dog had walked maybe 10 or 15 feet away from this campsite, two things happened in rapid succession. Number one, Ricky suddenly stopped and turned around and looked back at the campsite. And number two, right as he did this, there was this enormous bang sound, like a small explosion that echoed through the forest. Okay, so if you're not listening to our show called Run Fool, then you are really missing out on a truly special and unique podcast. Now, it's technically a horror podcast, but honestly, it's so much more. Every episode is a fresh take on terrifying lore, like a modern ghost story wrapped up in a tightly spun narrative. Also, remember, Run Fool is a Ballen Studios podcast, which means there's always going to be a big plot twist or reveal at the end. Rodney Barnes is the iconic host of Run Fool, and every story he tells on there, it feels like this fully immersive horror movie. Also, the sound design on this show is like expert level. Barnes really knows what he's doing. Even if you never watch the show, you should tune in just for a second, at least once, just to hear Barnes's radio voice. It is like the best, most soothing voice I think I've ever heard. So if Run Fool feels like a show you might like, go run and follow the show and start listening. Also, be sure you stick around till the end of today's video because we're going to play a clip from last week's episode of Run Fool. About 30 minutes later, and about 4 miles away from where Ricky and Sean and Scott had been, there were these two women who were in their house eating dinner when they heard this sudden frantic knocking on their front door. Now, these women live in a very isolated part of the country, and so the women were very concerned. One of them rushed over to the phone just to be ready to call the police, while the other very carefully made their way towards the front of the house, and they kind of peered out the window, but they couldn't see anything outside. It was too dark, and so they went to their door, which was still getting pounded on by whoever was out there, and the woman, she unlocked the door, and she opened it just a crack, and what she saw nearly made her faint. There was a man standing on her porch who was absolutely covered in blood, as if he had been fully submerged in a tank of blood. I mean, he is all red. And the man had his hand over his neck. And the woman who opened the door, she looked at him and she saw that there was this rhythmic pulsing of blood pumping out of his neck that was in time with his heart. This man is clearly bleeding to death. And so the woman, she screamed for the other woman to please call 911. We have someone who's dying here. And so she began calling 911. And then the man on the porch just said, please help me. And then he said something about Dismal Creek, and then he collapsed. And this was so shocking for the woman who had opened the door that she just stood there staring, having no idea what to do. But then she happened to look up and she noticed there was a Jeep that was idling out on the road in front of her house that she hadn't even registered until now. And so either this guy got dropped off or he drove that Jeep. But before she could even begin to understand what had just happened, an ambulance and a whole bunch of police cars came screaming up and parked in front of her house. And then the medics got out, they rushed up, and they grabbed the bleeding man, and they put him in the ambulance, and they rushed him off. Meanwhile, not far from the house, police officers were speeding towards Dismal Creek because when the women called 911, they said, this guy who's shown up on the porch bleeding said something about Dismal Creek, but they had no idea what it was about. And so instead of trying to wait to figure out what was even going on, police had basically said, let's just go to Dismal Creek and look around and see if we can figure out, why someone would leave that area and show up at this house covered in blood. But as the police were making their way up this winding mountain road, they saw a truck bombing down the road coming straight at them. And the truck, they initially hit their brakes and did kind of attempt to get out of the way of the police cars. But after this truck had basically come to a stop, the driver of the truck just hit the gas all over again, and they veered wildly off the side of the road into an embankment, and they crashed and flipped several times and then came to a stop. And the police officers who had veered to the side of the road to avoid getting hit by this truck, they just watched this happen and they couldn't understand why the driver had gunned it again after stopping and then seemingly intentionally drove off the road. It almost seemed like the driver was trying to crash. And so the police, they got out of their car and they approached the wrecked truck with their guns drawn. But when they looked into the vehicle, they saw there was a single occupant, the driver, and he was still somehow alive. So the police got him out of the vehicle and they called an ambulance, but they actually sent an officer with the ambulance to escort them because the police were actually pretty suspicious of this truck driver. Because remember, they were going up that road to get to Dismal Creek to see what had happened there that would lead to another man showing up on somebody's doorstep in the middle of the night covered in blood. And now they have this truck driver who looks like he's speeding away from Dismal Creek, who crashes his truck. I mean, there was no clear connection between the truck crash and the bloody guy, but the police were suspicious that they had to be connected. So they sent the officer to the hospital as well. About 30 minutes after the truck crash, the police left the scene and continued the rest of the way up the road to Dismal Creek. And once they got up there, the police fanned out all across the area and just began looking for anything. Just any clue that might explain what the heck happened here, if anything happened at Dismal Creek at all. And pretty quickly, the police actually did find something unique. In the middle of the Dismal Creek area, they found a campsite. But it was not the campsite where Sean and Scott were staying, where Ricky had gone and shared dinner with them. This was a different campsite. And not long after searching this other campsite, police concluded that whoever was staying here did not seem like they were mentally well. This seems like a mentally unstable and potentially dangerous person lives here. So the campsite was really simple. It was just a tent and a campfire. But when the police lifted up the flap and looked inside the tent, they found a collection of 30 knives along with a police scanner that basically picked up police radio chatter in the area, so you could listen to a scanner and basically know what the police were doing in your area. There were also all these weird piles of clothing. Some were for kids, some were for adults, some were for men, some were for women. There were piles of eyeglasses, and there were 8 pairs of women's underwear. And then also there was a map of the Appalachian Trail inside of this tent, and all over this map along the trail were all these spots that were circled, but there was no information about what these circles meant. However, one of the places that was circled was Dismal Creek. And then next to the map was a radio, and inside the radio was a cassette. And so the police just hit play, and immediately what they heard totally creeped them out, because the tape sounded like some kind of satanic ritual. It was basically this one man's voice just kind of howling and chanting over and over again. But by far, the most shocking thing that was found inside of that tent was a single piece of paper. And this piece of paper was a birth certificate, and the name on the birth certificate was a name that basically all police in this area knew, and in fact, anybody living in or around the Appalachian Trail definitely would know this name. And the identity of this person, the name on the birth certificate, was the key to putting together all these seemingly disconnected events that had happened on this night. From the explosion when Ricky walked away from the fire, to the bloody man at the house, to the truck crash, they were all connected through this single person. A few hours earlier, after Ricky had gotten up and walked away from Sean and Scott's campsite, and then after barely making it onto the trail, he had turned around and there was that loud explosion. Well, at that point in the story, Ricky, who's now looking back at the campsite and looking at Sean and Scott, he can see that the two of them, they've heard the sound too, and they were now staring at each other with looks of absolute shock and terror on their faces. But then Ricky watched as Sean reached up and touched his face, and he put his hand out in front of his face, and it was covered in red. And the reason for that was because Sean had just been shot in the face, because that loud explosion was the sound of Ricky shooting his gun at Sean. And as Sean and Scott stood there staring at each other in absolute disbelief, Ricky, who's still in the tree line, ran towards the fire and just kept on shooting. And so Sean, at this point, as he sees Ricky coming into the campsite, he stands up and kind of staggers back and falls on the ground. But Scott, who's not hurt at this point, he just gets up and starts running away from the campsite. And Ricky turns his attention towards Scott, and he shoots at him, and he hits him straight in the neck and also in the back. But somehow Scott just kept on running despite these horrible wounds. And so Ricky watched as Scott disappeared into the woods. And then Ricky turned back to Sean, who's laying on the ground and can't go anywhere. He's been shot in the face. And Ricky just casually raised his gun and shot Sean right in the chest. But amazingly, Sean, after getting shot this second time, it created what must have been the most extreme adrenaline rush ever, because he jumped up to his feet and right in front of his attacker, he just turned and sprinted to his Jeep. He hopped inside, fired it up, and just sped away as fast as he could. And when Sean flipped on his headlights and turned a corner after getting away from the campsite, he looked down the road and he actually saw his buddy, Scott, who had run away first, come tumbling out of the woods onto the road. And so Sean, who's gravely injured, drives over next to Scott, and he stops the Jeep long enough for Scott to climb inside, and they shut the door and they speed their way towards the nearest help, which happened to be that house where those two women lived. And so it was Scott, who looked like he was drenched in blood, who knocked on the women's door. Sean was down in the Jeep out on the road, but he was just too weak to get out and come up to the door as well. But when the ambulance and police arrived, they would find not only Scott up on the porch, but also Sean in the Jeep, and both men would be taken to the hospital via helicopter. And then as for the man who was driving the truck down the road away from Dismal Creek, who then crashed right in front of the police, well, the driver of that truck was Ricky Williams. However, that was not his real name. There was no Ricky Williams. That was the name he just used. His real name, which was on the birth certificate that police found in that other campsite inside of the tent, was Randall Lee Smith. The same infamous Randall Lee Smith who had murdered those two hikers not far from Dismal Creek. That double homicide had happened in 1981, and Randall was caught and convicted. But he was paroled 15 years later in 1996 for good behavior. And for 10 years after that, Randall lived with his mother, and he wore this electronic bracelet, and he followed the rules. But by 2008, his electronic bracelet had came off, and even though Randall had attempted to continue living with his mother, it just wasn't tenable. He didn't have enough money, and so ultimately he packed up his things, grabbed his dog, and moved out onto the Appalachian Trail. And on May 6th, 2008, when Sean and Scott arrived in Dismal Creek to go fishing, Randall was waiting. Nobody has any idea why Randall murdered those two hikers back in 1981 or why he targeted Sean and Scott in 2008. All we know is that Randall Lee Smith was very mentally unwell and very likely viewed the Appalachian Trail as like his sacred place. This is his home. This is the place he loves more than anything. And so maybe, he felt like Sean and Scott had somehow disrespected the Appalachian Trail, and that was enough to attack them. Now, we know Sean and Scott did not do anything intentionally disrespectful to Randall because, amazingly, Sean and Scott survived this attack. And they would say that when they saw Randall, they just felt bad for him. They thought he was like this alcoholic drifter who didn't have a home of his own, and so he was just living out in the woods on the Appalachian Trail. And so they didn't judge him. Instead, they really did just want to give him some food and spend some time with him and make him feel human again. That was it. And because Randall appeared to be this kind of small, older man, Sean and Scott, who were, very big and imposing, they didn't feel threatened by this guy. As for that bizarre other campsite that police found up around Dismal Creek, the one that contained all those knives and the birth certificate, well, obviously that was Randall's campsite. And that weird cassette tape that they listened to that sounded like a satanic ritual, that was Randall going through his meditations and chants that he would do when he was out in the middle of nowhere. It was like his way of respecting Mother Nature and the Appalachian Trail. And then all those items that were found inside of his tent, the different clothes and the eyeglasses and the women's underwear, it's believed those could be Randall's other victims. However, when police pulled DNA samples from all of those items that were found inside of his tent, like the clothes and the underwear and the eyeglasses, well, those DNA samples did not match any of the missing people or murder victims in the police's database, and so that wasn't useful. And then also, police went to all those places on that map that were circled, and with the exception of obviously Dismal Creek, they didn't find anything else at the other locations that suggested any violent event had happened there. So only Randall knows the truth, which means we will never know the truth, because just 4 days after Randall was pulled out of that truck that he crashed, he died in police custody from a blood clot that formed as a result of the crash. And in those 4 days that Randall was in custody, he never gave up that there were any other victims. Today, Sean still has a bullet in his head and in his chest, and Scott still has big scarring on his neck and on his back. But both men have made a full recovery, relatively speaking, and they still go back to Dismal Creek all the time to go camping and fishing. In a rural area of southwest Texas in 2016, a 49-year-old woman was out walking her dog. We don't know her name, so we'll call her Rhonda, and we don't know her dog's name, so the dog will be Max. Hiking with Max was Rhonda's way of unwinding and letting go of the day. As she walked, she took a moment to breathe in the fresh scent of pine trees and listen to the dried leaves crunch underneath her shoes. There was nobody else around, so Rhonda let Max off his leash. He ran ahead and played in the bushes, happy to be free after a day spent cooped up inside. But after a little while, a sharp yelp from Max cut through the quiet evening air. Rhonda sprinted down the path to where she last saw him and began shouting out his name. There were plenty of dangerous animals hiding in the tall brush. Snakes, kissing bugs, porcupines, even feral hogs were known to be spotted in this area. Max could have run into any one of them. Rhonda yelled again and again for Max, but she didn't hear anything. Then she heard whining, and Max came running toward her with his tail between his legs. Rhonda immediately clipped on his leash, relieved that he didn't have any visible injury. Rhonda decided to end the walk right there and head home, and then once she got there, she could clean Max up and make herself some dinner. The next few days were uneventful, but towards the end of that week, Rhonda started to feel under the weather. She didn't have much of an appetite, and it hurt whenever she swallowed cold drinks. She figured she might have a mild flu or maybe a sore throat, but as the days went by, she kept feeling worse and worse. She couldn't catch her breath and her chest hurt, and no matter what she did, Rhonda just could not get comfortable, especially when she laid down. Rhonda had high blood pressure, which had caused symptoms like this in the past, but she had been faithfully taking her blood pressure medication, so she didn't understand why she was now feeling this bad. She decided not to take any chances and went to the emergency room of a nearby hospital. As Rhonda sat in the waiting room, all she could think about was the pain in her chest. Whatever this was, it didn't feel like a simple blood pressure issue. A nurse asked Rhonda some basic background questions, like whether she drank alcohol or used tobacco. She admitted to having the occasional drink, but she said she never smoked. She said she didn't do any drugs either. Then, Rhonda was given an electrocardiogram, which is a simple test that records the electrical activity of the heart and indicates any problems with the heartbeat. After the test was done, a doctor came in and read through the results. He said everything looked perfectly fine, but Rhonda told him she was scared. She was certain there was something going on, but he just shook his head and told her she should stay calm. She was probably just having some sort of panic attack. But despite her protests, Rhonda was just given a prescription for anxiety medication and then sent home. But as the week progressed, her pain only got worse. Rhonda couldn't take 2 steps without feeling nauseous. She felt like something heavy was sitting on her chest, trying to squeeze out her breath. Even her dog Max seemed to sense her pain, whining every time she sat up in bed, trying to catch her breath. Rhonda decided to go back to the ER, but this time she went to a different hospital. She didn't want to be sick, but she also didn't want a potentially dangerous condition to go untreated. And the doctors at this hospital were much more willing to listen to Rhonda. In addition to the same test she got at the other ER, this ER also ordered a CAT scan of Rhonda's chest, which is a procedure that uses a series of X-rays to create detailed images inside the body. This time, when the doctor came to Rhonda's bedside to go over her test results, Rhonda could instantly tell something was wrong. The doctor told Rhonda that there was fluid collecting in her chest. This fluid was putting pressure on her heart and causing her to feel tired and breathless. He didn't know why this fluid was collecting, but they needed to keep a close eye on it. If the pressure built up too much, Rhonda's heart could be permanently damaged. Rhonda was then officially moved from the ER to a room in the hospital itself. She was nervous but also relieved. They might not know exactly what was wrong with her yet, but at least they weren't insisting that it was just an anxiety attack. By early the next morning, Rhonda's symptoms had not improved, and even with the pain medication, she could barely sleep. Her chest still hurt too much. A nurse came into Rhonda's room to draw blood, but right after the nurse inserted the needle into Rhonda's arm, something strange happened. Rhonda's feet and hands started turning blue. At the same time, her heart rate slowed and her blood pressure plummeted. The pain in Rhonda's chest grew worse, and she tried not to groan. Instead, she clenched her hands into fists so tight her nails almost cut through her skin. She thought of poor Max waiting for her at home. All she wanted was to cuddle with him and feel his wet nose on her face. As doctors rushed in, Rhonda could tell that things were just getting worse. The doctors measured her heartbeat and then gave her an injection to increase her heart rate and blood pressure. Once Rhonda was stabilized, her cardiologist arrived at her bedside. He could see that the excess fluid around Rhonda's heart was exerting more pressure. It was getting so intense that it could stop her heart from beating. There was no time for the doctor to make a precise diagnosis. Rhonda needed surgery right now. That fluid had to be drained or she was going to die. They could figure out what was actually wrong with her afterwards. Rhonda was rushed into surgery, and doctors removed almost 2 cups of fluid from the sac surrounding Rhonda's heart. They also put in a chest tube that would help keep the fluid from building back up. Her cardiologist hoped that the procedure would be enough to stabilize her. Right away, Rhonda started to feel better. Her vital signs improved, and she was able to eat a little bit and even check in with her dog sitter. After almost 2 weeks of feeling totally sick, and now 48 hours in the hospital, Rhonda told herself that this terrible ordeal might finally be over. Over the next couple of days, she improved enough for her doctors to remove the chest tube that was draining the excess fluid from her heart. But just after getting the chest tube removed, Rhonda again started feeling intense pressure in her chest. More tests were done, and they revealed that fluid was reaccumulating around her heart at an alarming rate. Rhonda's blood pressure suddenly dropped and her body went into shock. Her surgical team sprang back into action. Once again, she was wheeled into surgery to drain the fluid from around her heart. This time, almost 4 cups were removed, twice as much as the first time. Rhonda's cardiologist and his team placed 3 chest tubes around Rhonda's heart to keep the waves of pressure from killing her. After surgery, Rhonda was returned to the ICU, exhausted and barely conscious. But even all those tubes couldn't stop the fluid from building back up. Instead of getting better, Rhonda remained in critical condition. They were running out of time to save her. Her doctors watched over her with a sense of dread, wondering how they could possibly stabilize her if she crashed again. 6 terrifying days later, doctors drained her heart for the 3rd time. This time, though, her cardiologist noticed something strange in the bloody liquid they drained out of her chest. He examined it and realized that the liquid was full of blood clots. Rhonda must be bleeding internally. If one of those clots made its way into her heart, it could block an important artery. This would cause cardiac arrest and kill Rhonda in seconds. Her cardiologist ordered more scans and then carefully studied each one. And that's when he noticed something truly puzzling. Rhonda's aorta, which is the large artery connected to the heart, showed a small, thin shadow. The cardiologist was baffled by it. He knew it had to be connected to the bleeding, but he couldn't tell what it was, and he had to find out. To do this, he needed to see Rhonda's heart completely still and without any blood to obscure the view. While it sounded impossible, there was a way to do this. He needed to perform an incredibly dangerous surgery, the kind of surgery that he would only do when there was no other choice. He dreaded reaching this decision, but it was the only way to save her life. Rhonda would have to be put into a state called total circulatory arrest. The surgical team would do this by first drastically lowering her body temperature. Then they would have to stop her heart from pumping. Rhonda would be in suspended animation, with no pulse, no blood pressure, and no signs of brain activity. She would basically be no different from someone who was actually dead. Putting Rhonda into the state would allow her doctors to see what was wrong with her heart, but it only gave surgeons an extremely short window of time to work, about 40 minutes. If it went on any longer, they might not be able to bring Rhonda back. As the surgical suite was prepped for the procedure, the cardiologist and his team went through every minute detail of the operation. Then the surgeon took a deep breath and began the process of putting Rhonda into deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. A cooled saline solution was slowly injected into Rhonda's blood. This lowered her body temperature to somewhere between 64 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit and caused her blood to stop flowing. A machine took over her breathing. Once all her body functions had stopped, the cardiologist called for a scalpel and made his first incision. The entire surgical team watched as he cut through the sac surrounding Rhonda's heart, carefully pushing aside tiny blood vessels until he was able to make an incision in the aorta. Wearing specialized magnifying glasses, he carefully examined Rhonda's heart. Within moments, he was stunned to see an object deeply embedded inside of her aorta. He carefully removed it with micro forceps and dropped it in a specimen jar. Then he cut out the damaged part of the aorta, repaired it with the synthetic graft, and closed Rhonda back up. Then the team slowly and carefully raised Rhonda's body temperature. Her heart was restarted with a defibrillator. In minutes, blood was pumping through her veins again, and color started to return to her face. As Rhonda was wheeled back to the ICU to recover, the object that had been pulled out of her aorta was already being closely examined by pathology. By the next day, Rhonda's medical team knew the very risky surgery had worked. The fluid had stopped accumulating around Rhonda's heart, and she said she was starting to feel better. Over the next several days, the lab analyzed this object that had been pulled out of her that had basically pierced a hole through her aorta. Rhonda was in her hospital room chatting with some family when her cardiologist entered, holding something in a small glass jar. He told her that the pathology department had a little present for her. They knew what had caused her near-death crisis. The object from her aorta that had nearly killed her was an inch-long, black and extremely sharp porcupine quill. But now the question was, how had it gotten inside of her? It happened more than a month earlier, on the day she went for a walk with her dog Max in the woods. When Max ran into the brush and began whimpering and whining, he had encountered an angry porcupine. Later, when Rhonda got home, she saw several quills sticking out of Max's fur. Rhonda had painstakingly removed them, but while she was doing this, she had accidentally swallowed a porcupine quill and somehow didn't notice. The quill poked a hole in her esophagus and then made its way to her aorta, where it caused her to bleed into the sac around her heart. Since she had no idea that she had swallowed a quill, she never thought it was necessary to tell her doctors about the incident with her dog and the porcupine. 3 weeks after she was first admitted to the hospital, Rhonda made a full recovery and went home. She still went on long walks with Max and still let him run free into the brush. She wasn't the kind of person who lived in fear, but her heart always started to beat a little faster whenever Max ran out of sight for more than a few minutes. Somewhere out there in the brush, there might still be a stubborn porcupine with a few missing quills waddling around. And now here is our second story called The Experiment. On a spring evening in 2014, 43-year-old Amy Pearl looked out the kitchen window of her neighbor's brownstone in Brooklyn, New York. About 20 people were packed into the tiny backyard for a cookout. Amy was making a vegetable dish, so she was sautéing some wild onions that she'd picked from her mother's garden. After the onions were ready, she headed outside to join the party, where the host was now cooking a giant rack of lamb on a charcoal grill. Amy mingled with her friends until it was time to eat. Then they all sat down at a long table. The lamb, wild onions, and assorted roasted vegetables made for a delicious meal. Amy even sneaked some meat to her dog, a brown and white pit bull mutt named Cola. Amy couldn't help but think about how lucky she was. She was a successful radio producer living just minutes away from Manhattan, in a city full of things to do and great food to eat. And she had a group of amazing friends to enjoy it with. A few hours later, the party ended, so Amy said her goodbyes and headed back to her own apartment with her dog. After she got home, Amy went to bed. It was midnight and she was ready to get some sleep. But a couple of hours later, she woke up and just felt totally strange. A wave of anxiety hit her, but she wasn't sure why. She decided to get up and go to the bathroom. When she walked in and flipped on the light, she took a look at her face in the mirror. She was shocked when she saw her reflection. Her face looked misshapen and her eyes were swollen. Amy could barely recognize herself and immediately knew something was wrong. Then she was hit by this awful dizzy spell. In a daze, Amy walked back toward her bedroom. She was so dizzy she had to hold on to the walls for support, but she managed to get back to her room and climb into her bed. As soon as she lay down, she felt like she was going to pass out. Amy stood back up and attempted to walk off her dizziness as her dog, Cola, followed her around the apartment. As she paced around, Amy started to have these intense stomach cramps. Her mind began to race and she wondered what was happening. Amy wondered if she had accidentally poisoned herself with something she ate from the dinner party. She thought maybe there might have been a snail hidden on the wild onions, or maybe the onions themselves were just poisonous. She was worried she might have poisoned her friends too. So far, no one had texted or called her though, so she hoped everything was okay. As her anxiety intensified, Amy got up and returned to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, which helped calm her down a bit. She dried her face off with a hand towel and realized she no longer felt dizzy. Amy told herself that maybe a night's rest would just fix everything, so she returned to her bedroom and finally fell asleep. The next morning, Amy woke up feeling much better. Her stomach had stopped hurting and her face looked normal again. However, she wanted to figure out what had happened. She figured the best way to start was to check in on her friends who had gone to the same party the night before. Amy picked up her phone and dialed the neighbor who had hosted the cookout. She didn't want to alarm them by talking about her symptoms, so she just asked them how they felt the party went. The host was very happy with everything and thanked Amy for making the wild onions. Amy got off the phone feeling totally relieved, and so she called some more people who attended the party, and again, everyone just seemed fine and had a great time. Amy was left totally bewildered and without any answers about what had happened to her, but she ultimately just chalked up the whole thing to an upset stomach and tried to move on. A week later, on a Saturday night, Amy decided to stay in with her dog, Cola, instead of going out with her friends. She decided to make a cheeseburger and french fries for dinner, so she pulled a frozen patty out of the freezer and turned on the stove. When the burger was done, Amy placed a slice of cheese right on top and watched it melt. Then she put the burger on a bun and added the fries that she had cooked in the oven. Amy grabbed a can of soda from her fridge, she sat down on the couch next to Cola, and took her first bite of the burger. The patty was a pink medium rare, the cheese was melted and gooey, and the fries were perfectly salted. Amy savored every bite and then watched a movie. 2 hours later, as the credits of the movie began to roll, Amy hugged her dog. As he licked her face, she started to feel lightheaded. She stood up too quickly and nearly fell over. Amy braced herself against the wall and struggled to catch her breath. Her chest began to tighten, and she started breathing faster and faster, and so kind of in a panic, Amy began trying to take deep breaths to calm herself down, and as her breathing did begin to settle, all she could think about was what had happened to her after her neighborhood party a week earlier. But this felt different, and much worse. Amy made her way into the bathroom, and just like last week, she looked in the mirror and her face looked swollen, and now she noticed there was also a rash on her hands. She lifted her shirt and saw that her stomach was also covered in swollen red hives. She didn't know what to do. Her only thought was to make her way to the living room and unlock her front door, just in case she needed to call 911 but passed out before paramedics arrived. Then she staggered into her bedroom as Cola followed along. Amy wondered if there was a virus going around, or if maybe she was allergic to a new pollen, or worse, maybe she was allergic to her dog Cola. Amy didn't want to think about that possibility because she loved her dog. She remembered how helpful sleep had been the last time this happened a week earlier, so she decided not to call 911 just yet. She relocked her front door and made her way back to her room. Exhausted, she collapsed onto her bed and she fell asleep. Just like the last time she got sick, Amy woke up the next morning feeling much better. The swelling on her stomach had gone down, and the hives were less noticeable, but she was still worried, so she grabbed her laptop off the floor. She opened a web browser and typed all of her symptoms into the Google search bar. A list of articles and links popped up. Amy scanned the list, her eyes widening as she saw a particular article. She clicked that link and read more. It was about a man in Florida who had experienced the same sudden symptoms as her. She wasn't sure what it all meant, but maybe it was connected to what was happening with her. Amy printed out the article because she felt like she was onto something. A few days later, Amy was seated on the examination table as her doctor stood close by. Her hives had disappeared by the time her appointment had arrived, and the doctor didn't seem too worried. Despite this, Amy described the 2 incidents and her various symptoms in great detail as the doctor took notes. But the entire time, Amy was thinking about the article she had printed out. She had even brought it with her to the appointment. Amy hesitated to bring up the article to her doctor. She didn't want to sound like one of those people who self-diagnosed based on what they read online. Instead, when she was on her way out of the appointment, she left the article with the receptionist and asked them to please give it to her doctor. The next day, Amy called the doctor and asked whether she could be tested for the condition the article mentioned. The doctor said he had read the article and that in his opinion, it just wasn't possible. Amy had nothing to worry about, and he didn't think she needed to do any special testing. He was confident that it was just not a problem. Amy felt kind of defeated and no closer to knowing what had actually happened to her. A few days later, Amy was back to feeling basically like herself. She was at the local supermarket, pushing a cart full of groceries down the aisle. She eyed the food in her cart and was struck with an idea. Her doctor had seemed so sure there wasn't anything wrong with her, but Amy wasn't as certain, so she decided to run a test on herself. She would go to her mom's house and do the experiment there, just in case something terrible happened. Later that afternoon, Amy's mother, Susan Von Eggers, stood at the island in her kitchen in Danbury, Connecticut, about 2 hours away from Brooklyn. Susan was cutting up vegetables from her garden when she heard a knock at the door. She walked over to let in Amy, and then she gave her a hug. As Susan led her daughter back to the kitchen, Amy told her about this experiment she had planned. She was going to cook some food and eat it as a test, then wait to see if she got sick. Susan didn't know what to make out of Amy's experiment, but she was determined to help her daughter figure out what had made her so sick. Susan walked out into the spacious backyard, where she fired up the grill, and then they cooked their meal. Shortly after, they took a seat at the patio table. It was time for the experiment. Susan watched closely as Amy took her first bite of food. Her daughter slowly chewed and swallowed. They both waited, but so far, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Then Susan began eating. She soon noticed that Amy had barely touched the rest of her food. Amy said she was just too nervous and didn't want to eat anymore. Susan felt bad for Amy. Normally, her daughter had a healthy appetite and a deep appreciation for food. But the next 2 hours went by and Susan and Amy relaxed in the backyard, chatting and enjoying the sunshine, and Amy just seemed totally fine, which was a huge relief for Susan. But several minutes later, she noticed Amy became very quiet and then grabbed at her stomach. She quickly excused herself to the bathroom. Susan watched, unsure what to do, as Amy jogged to the back door and disappeared inside. 20 minutes later, Amy returned and looked very pale. She asked if her mother could drive her to the emergency room. Susan's stomach dropped, and for a split second, she couldn't think straight. She jumped up and said she needed to change her clothes. Even as she said it, she realized how absurd it sounded. She frantically ran to her bedroom, but a minute later, she heard something slam against her door. Susan opened the door and saw that Amy had collapsed on the floor in the hallway. Susan immediately felt so bad for delaying getting Amy to the hospital. She ran over and kneeled down and leaned close to her daughter's face, and she could tell that Amy was still breathing. Susan found Amy's phone on the ground next to her. She realized that Amy must have thrown it at her door to get her attention. Susan picked up Amy's phone and she dialed 911. Paramedics arrived and immediately took Amy to the hospital. She was conscious when she arrived at the emergency room a few minutes later. She was immediately given a shot of a drug called epinephrine to prevent her from going into anaphylactic shock. Anaphylactic shock is a severe allergic reaction that can result in fainting, difficulty in breathing, and even death if it's not treated right away. Amy was able to speak, so she was able to tell the ER doctor what her theory was for what was going on with her. Amy wasn't sure the doctor believed her, but the doctor promised to run the necessary tests to prove or disprove Amy's theory. Amy was stabilized and moved to a hospital room. Her mother was by her side, and they waited anxiously for the results of the tests. A couple of hours later, the ER doctor rushed in. He said he knew exactly what was happening and that Amy had been right. The article Amy had found 2 weeks ago was about a man who had developed a meat allergy. The doctor who Amy had first shown this article to just didn't believe that it was possible that Amy could have this allergy, and so did not think the test was necessary. But Amy was determined to find out, so she attempted that experiment, which unfortunately worked. She and her mom had grilled that porterhouse steak at her mom's house. Amy had only taken a couple of bites, but it was enough to set off an allergic reaction that almost killed her. And now the doctor in the ER confirmed it for her. Amy had a life-threatening allergy to red meat. Finally, Amy understood exactly what was wrong with her. But even though she had a diagnosis, she still wasn't satisfied. In fact, it led Amy to a bigger question. How could she have suddenly become allergic to something she had eaten without any issues her entire life? When her doctor explained the reason, it all made sense to her, as crazy as it sounded. It all started a few weeks before the neighborhood cookout, when Amy woke up one morning. The back of her arm felt itchy, and when she scratched it, she discovered a tick. She knew exactly where it had come from, her dog Cola. The tick had clearly been on her dog, and then hopped onto Amy in the middle of the night while Cola was sleeping in bed with her. When Amy was bitten by that tick, she developed a new allergy to red meat called alpha-gal syndrome. The tick carries a sugar molecule called alpha-gal, which is found in the blood of the animals the tick usually bites, such as cows, sheep, rabbits, deer, or pigs. When a tick bites a human, it automatically transmits alpha-gal into that person's body. After Amy was bitten, she developed a sensitivity to alpha-gal. This meant that her body now saw this sugar molecule as a foreign invader and attacked it. So every time Amy ate red meat, which contains alpha-gal, she would become progressively sicker. Her body would release histamines, which cause allergy symptoms such as hives, swelling, and difficulty breathing, as well as anaphylactic shock. It just so happens that Amy's symptoms were particularly severe. It is estimated that almost 450,000 people in the United States have developed alpha-gal allergy in the same way as Amy, which would make it the 10th most common allergy in the entire country. Up to 60% of people with red meat allergies can experience severe symptoms. There is currently no cure. After Amy learned about her diagnosis, she realized she could never eat red meat again, which included beef, venison, pork, and lamb. They had been her favorite foods since she was a kid. After being released from the hospital, she decided to go on a strict vegetarian diet for personal reasons. She continues to go see her allergist for testing to see if anything has changed, but her alpha-gal antibody levels are still present in her bloodstream. Now, Amy has made peace with the lifestyle change and has even learned to appreciate it, especially considering her deep love of animals.
Just where to go. Ooh, like some melody with a beat so sweet. Ooh, come along with me, feel the dancing feet. La la la, dreamland, we can do anything. La la la, hand in hand, come and join the flame. La la la, dream.
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Matt Marinovich and Tanner Marcasello. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak, Natalie Bettendorf, and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomanang. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Senior producers are Laura Donna Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall